Can you afford to die? From ancient Egypt to the here and now, death is expensive, and every industry gets their cut. Funeral homes, florists, photographers, casket makers. It's a long list. It's an industry high in emotion and deep in spirituality, relatively unquestioned, and therefore ripe for exploitation. My next guest is the Goodrich C. White Professor of American Religious History and Cultures at Emory University in Georgia, and his work covers sex, death, religion, and psychedelics. So naturally a perfect fit for this show. He's the author of multiple books, but I learned about him from The Mortician, an HBO documentary covering a 1980s funeral home that exploited grieving families. Today we're going to unpack the shady and the sacred of funeral directors being both an authority in the afterlife and a gatekeeper in the big business of dying, as we ask the question, is it ethical to profit from death? This is the Curious Introvert podcast with me, Meredith. Around here, we explore taboo questions and societal blind spots. Please help me welcome author and professor of the taboo, the man who sees the religion in modern life that other people miss, Dr. Gary Laderman. Thanks for being here.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the introduction, and I love the professor of taboo. That's a new one to me.
Well, it just really seems to fit because of all the stuff that you cover. And when I read that you not only explore these fringe accepted topics of death, but also of sex, religion, and psychedelics, I was like, oh, that's my guy.
Well, yeah, it seemed as soon as I heard of you and your podcast that there was great alignment there. So I'm glad to be here with you.
Well, good. Well, maybe we should start where all the good stuff always is, which is ancient Egypt, right? So for the people whose job it was to care for the dead and prepare them for the afterlife, on like a social scale of, say, like trash man to Supreme Court justice, how elevating was the job of death worker in ancient Egypt?
My sense was it's a very sacred position. It was generally accepted rather than looked down upon. But the people who handle the dead are not always holy or considered sacred or working within some kind of religious cosmology. There are often the cases where it's the lower castes who are the ones who are most appropriate to handle the dead. So there's always been a kind of ambivalence throughout human history around, like, what do we do with the dead and who is charged with that responsibility?
Yeah, and do we want to hang out with them afterwards?
Exactly. Yeah. What do we think of them in terms of their place within society? And that's where American funeral directors get interesting, but maybe I'm jumping the gun.
Yeah, it does definitely get interesting. And especially when you layer in the paying of the service, right? And the reason that I wanted to go back to ancient Egypt, because I always find the historical context very grounding, but I mean, I was so excited to go back to ancient Egypt with you, but now that I'm here, I'm thinking, you're right. It's a big jump from ancient Egypt to small town America. It's almost like we're talking about another planet.
In some sense, although, again, we're talking about death, which unites us all, and has always presented a peculiar dilemma for human societies and human cultures. And there is no uniform answer.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're right. You said death is a universal experience. I think that the quality of humans to survive is also universal. Do you know anything about the commerce of, tiered burial packages in ancient Egypt? Was it like it was today? Like, well, for another $9.99, you can get a gold face mask.
I'm not an expert in this culture, but I think there was a degree of variation in what people were allowed to do, but there also were limitations as well. People were able to, for a price, be able to get a particular papyrus or a certain kind of recitation that might be done that would cost something. But there too, I think there were strictures within different ancient Egyptian societies as to what was even possible, depending on where you were in terms of social class.
That thought kind of makes the modern funeral industry that much more complicated when it comes to the economics of it, right? Because we have all this choice in the US. We kind of like pride ourselves on that, actually, choice and individualism. And I could totally see how that would make the mourning process more complicated because it's like there is no groove to set your next step into. You have to decide it on your own.
Yes, I think that's a really insightful comment about the American landscape. I would only add that, at least from what I've been able to research, there's a difference between America before the Civil War and America after the Civil War in all kinds of ways, but certainly in terms of what you're talking about, like choices. Generally, it was pretty uniform in antebellum America, that is pre-Civil War America, and how people made sense of death, handled the dead, and mourned the dead. Not completely uniform, but there was a great deal of consensus in that particular kind of social historical period.
What did they do?
The quick version is they generally died at home and before the Civil War. So the deathbed was a very important sacred space. Then within 3 days, often be put on some kind of public display within a coffin. Then the body would be transported generally to a meeting house or maybe the church, where there would be some service with the body present, but not public. And then from there, it generally went to a graveyard. No choices, really, at this stage in American history. Only one choice, interment. And everyone was interred, mostly, generally, in individual graves. But that obviously could depend on social class, on ethnic community, on racial kinds of demographics as well. But in general, we had a pretty kind of common sense of the shared experience of death before the Civil War.
So, were there assigned people to handle the dead, to move them from one place to the other, to position them for those public viewing ceremonies?
I generally try to describe the characteristics of this period and this relationship with the dead as being one of characterized by intimacy. So there was a kind of intimacy between the living and the dead in pre-Civil War America, and generally small towns and villages, some bigger urban areas. But for the most part, it would be pretty DIY in a sense that people would sort of do it themselves. A local carpenter might be employed or volunteer to make a coffin. The family division of labor based on gender would be involved in handling the body and getting it ready for either, being presented in some way or to be buried in the ground. So it was a community kind of family affair that was also characterized by a sense that corpses were everywhere. Mortality rates were completely different in this period. So that intimacy wasn't just with the living community and the deceased, but a kind of whole general collective awareness of the materiality of death, just because so many people around Americans were dying.
Well, I'm so glad that you brought that up because okay, I'll admit, I follow this lady on Instagram and her family is from Appalachia and she shares cultural aspects of it, which I find really interesting because it is very different from anything I have known growing up in Nebraska and having also Southern relatives. So I have a little bit of both, but none of that is in that region. And I think she shared once that in the old Appalachian tradition, when the dead were in the home, there was a certain door that they would exit. Like they wouldn't go through the front door and they would cover the mirrors and do all this stuff. But I found that so interesting that in what I presumed to be mostly Christian America, there was all these kind of pagan-ish traditions around death.
It's fascinating. To your point, you're exactly right. I mean, again, overgeneralization to just talk about what Christians do,
Right.
or what Protestants do, or what Catholics do. I mean,
Or
there's,
Pentecostals. Don't
well,
forget the Pentecostals.
100%. You know, there's an internal diversity and variation within all of these labels that we use that makes it difficult to sort of make generalizations like that I'm making. But there, again, you can talk about certain patterns. And I mean, certainly Christianity is the driving force in shaping most death practices in America, for sure. But when you branch out and then look into Appalachia, or look into the Rocky Mountains or the Northeast, you'll find the different flavors, different, kind of aesthetics around the death and what we should do with them.
Well, almost like superstitions, this is totally your area, right? Because you study religion, which is essentially, when we boil down all the bits, it's human behavior, right? Because it's like the human drivers of our human behavior, like what's deep, deep, deep within. And I feel like when someone dies, how you behave, that's what you really believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what's so interesting to me is like, okay, so they really believed that it was important to cover the mirrors and that it was important to the dead have their own door in and out of the home. And I don't remember what the consequence was if that wasn't followed, but like that was real to them. And certainly in other parts of the South, we have the tradition of the cardinal. You know, if a loved one passes and you see a cardinal, that is your loved one saying one final goodbye.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a Southern thing. So it's like, well, that's interesting. This little messy cross section of all these elements.
Absolutely. And again, then when you bring in the complicated cultural influences, cultural, religious, spiritual influences of African American cultures and Native American cultures within the larger mix, it does get, as you say, very messy, but also so rich, in thinking about the flexibility, the adaptability, the kind of creativity that's associated with our religious experiences, with religious sensibilities that often spill out from dogma or from institutional settings where, there are more formal kinds of ritual activities and expressions of religious sensibilities. We know there's so much more religious life going on than what is taking place in a temple or a mosque or a church and so on.
Yeah, lots of layers. What stands out to you as some of the more memorable like death practices, whether they be in broader cultures like the Southeast United States in general, or some of these subgroups that you mentioned?
Oh, there's so many. I encourage people to go out and do some research.
And ask people. I think that'd be a great icebreaker.
Well,
like, did you find boop, boop? Did you find everything at the grocery store okay today? Yes, I did. Tell me about your family's death practices.
Well, yeah, that's a more difficult way to proceed. But there are a lot of books and articles that cover this. But I mean, even thinking about what we were talking about earlier, and the sort of role and the status and the integration of people whose responsibility are to take care of the dead. So what I have studied is looking at the evolution, if you will, of the funeral director and the set of practices and rituals that really help to establish the funeral industry as a multi-billion-dollar force in America. What has always struck me is the ways in which, even as the funeral industry grew and expanded, the funeral director was often disparaged and the object of all kinds of negative stereotypes. So I find that interesting. But the point is to think again in a different cultural setting and think about African Americans and the ways in which in African American cultures the funeral industry evolved and developed along the same lines as white American culture. with the funeral director embalming funeral homes and so on. But in African American cultures, the funeral director was highly esteemed and had all kinds of sort of positive associations in terms of their sort of sacred duties in handling the dead for African American families. And that disparity struck me as something that was unusual and I think spoke to all kinds of interesting, deep cultural values.
So that's been consistent throughout time, is that the funeral director in African American communities is an elevated position, whereas in white America, it's been mostly shady.
I wouldn't call it shady, but at least in popular consciousness, people have a negative view of funeral directors generally. And I think that's been consistent from the get-go, from the early 20th century. And looking at, again, the same parallel historical track in African American cultures, where you see the similar kind of rise of the funeral industry, which you see in Jewish cultures, Catholic culture. This is something that again becomes very much an American institution, the funeral home, across these cultures. But looking kind of at the same trajectory in African American cultures, there does seem to be more consistency in, again, and popular consciousness of sort of valuing the work of the Black undertaker, the Black funeral director.
Interesting. I enjoyed your book, by the way, Rest in Peace.
Oh, yeah.
I know this is just one of many, but this is the one that was most relevant for our talk today. But in your book, I was surprised, I guess, interested in that both Mark Twain and Charles Dickens really lean into the image of death workers being not looked upon very favorably. Mr. Sowerberry and Oliver Twist exploited a mourning family. And then in Life on the Mississippi, an old friend found his true calling as an undertaker and was like so full of joy. But the joy was because his pockets were full of money. So is this so old we don't know where it comes from? Can we answer the question, where does that image come from?
So there is, I think, in deeper levels of culture, this sort of association with death workers, people who are close to the dead, and the presence of evil or some kind of malevolence that has to sort of explain that connection. In America, though, I think it's very much a product of the very overt integration of capitalism and mortuary work with the rise of funeral homes and their pretty rapid success in terms of the marketplace of finding a niche that really they, excuse the word, exploited. That really seemed to be perfect timing in terms of American attitudes toward death and the dead. The funeral industry for sure helped to shape attitudes as well, but that was more of a kind of reciprocal process. So there is a sense, I think, historically of Americans being both very passionate capitalists, but also having a kind of caution or uncertainty about the idea of making money from the dead or from death. And I think it's that discomfort that helped to lead to this projection of the funeral director as some sort of evil, scandalous, corrupted figure.
Yeah, that's interesting because you were just saying pre-Civil War America, everyone was very intimate with the dead. It was a very normal and practical thing to take your dead loved one and to handle them and move them around and then ultimately bury them. And so, it wouldn't have been seen as creepy crawly or, oh, what an outsider. No, that's just, we were getting the job done. But then enter money. I guess that's where that's the magic ingredient.
Economics is very much a part of this story, but certainly the rise of consumerism and a particular kind of capitalism in the more modern period, particularly I think after the Civil War and with great industrialization and all kinds of social and cultural transformations around making money. So consumerism and that sensibility really seeps into, and becomes very much a driving force of the funeral industry. And that, to your point, again, signals an alienation, what I refer to as an intimacy lost, where now there are mediators who step in.
Well, I think in your book you called it the medicalization of death, where it's like, whoa, I'm not qualified to do whatever's next. And so we're going to hand it off to the professionals.
And that's especially pertinent because of embalming. And embalming doesn't exist, at least in the way we think about it, before the Civil War. After the Civil War, it becomes the foundation stone of this new industry that takes shape and takes hold. And so there is that. I don't know. I'll use this word carefully, but there is that mystery of what do the embalmers do, or I don't want to know what the embalmers do. So it becomes shrouded in secrecy again, but also an aspect of this new mediation that is surrounding death in the early 20th century.
You know what I just realized is these attitudes were also gaining popularity in birth, right? Because we used to have, yes, are those two thumbs up?
Yes.
Because we used to have, home births and midwives and, qualified aunties would come over and do the thing. And then it was like, no. I know you're a woman and I know I'm a man, but I'm going to tell you, instead of squatting, you really need to lay on your back in this hospital.
Yeah.
And we're going to not wash our hands and all this stuff. It really shifted the outsourcing of that part of our personhood, both birth and death.
Oh, you are so right on. And it was leading me into my segue into this period of great social transformation, the early 20th century, when we see the rise of the funeral industry. But we also see, as you're pointing out, the rise of the modern hospital. Hospitals become the place of birth, but they also become the new places of dying. So the space of dying in the home was transported to the emerging hospitals that are becoming these sites of care for the body and the battle to ward off death by the new biomedical culture that helped to bring hospitals into a reality and to have social authority and legitimation. So in this case too, there is a new specialist, a new mediator who takes control, in this case, of the dying individual, who were often sequestered in hospitals from the family or from community, but surrounded by strangers. But people we now put our faith in to save us. So for me, this biomedical culture that seems so scientific and medicalized and secularized is in fact, rife with religious sensibilities and religious potentialities in terms of our modern religious lives,
Yeah, because you're not allowed to question the doctor, or you weren't then.
Exactly. Oh, I mean, I hate to say it, but I wrote this article called The Cult of Doctors that looked at this brain surgeon who became a sensation, who was hailed as this superhero in the early 20th century. His name was Harvey Cushing. And he perfected all of these new methods for brain surgery where people stopped dying, during the brain surgery. And he was a sort of celebrity. But in that sense, too, there's a shift in American religious attachments and investments that move out of the pulpit and into medicine, into popular culture, and so on. So I think there are religious shadings, if not explicit, kind of religious meanings that are associated with the rise of the hospital in the early 20th century.
Oh, hey, you're still here. You must be a true curiositor. Okay, The truth is, I'm buttering you up. My analytics show that half of you listen on Apple Podcasts, and it would mean a lot to me if you would leave a rating and review there. And if you're one of the generous few who have already done that, I'd like to invite you to my private Facebook group. Just search MFR Curious Insiders on Facebook or click the link in the show notes to request to join. It's free. Okay, back to the show. As a researcher, do you see that just as like, I don't know, par for the course or the human condition, that we just mystify everything, we make everything spiritual, we make, even if we don't use that language, even if we're like, oh, I believe in science, even the way that we word things like that has this foundational language, like the infrastructure of it is by its nature spiritual.
100%. I mean, I hesitate to say that because I'm not a theologian, but I think that is human nature. I think we're built to be religious. So, that gets me in trouble with a lot of atheists. But I think, again, it's in our constitution to, try to search for our true identity, for find means of transcendence, to participate in rituals that provide order and stability, to be influenced by myths or sacred stories that make an impression on our moral sensibilities or whatever. But I agree with your point. I think it's sort of built in somewhere that we need to be religious, spiritual.
Well, we're meaning makers, I think, because we're not like, I don't know, I obviously would love to speak animal, but I don't speak animal. But I would assume that, a squirrel, for example, she is not really consumed with anything other than her next meal and reproduction and not dying. And so because we as humans kind of figure that other stuff out, we can think about stuff. So we like to wonder.
Okay, let me try to mess with that a little bit.
Okay.
Which ties into, I have to say it, this new book that I wrote.
Okay.
That's on psychoactive substances and religious life. It's called Sacred Drugs. But in the research I did for that, and I write about it a bit in the book, is the incredible fact that there's all kinds of evidence of animals who seek out ways to alter their consciousness, to become intoxicated in some form. Maybe not alter the consciousness, that might be going too far. But there is, clearly evidence of elephants, of different birds, all kinds of different species who will, in the wild, again, go after substances that can have an intoxicating effect. I love what you were saying about the animals and the humans, but it really sort of triggered that thought that maybe there's more going on with animals than just, dealing with death or reproduction and so on. And
can I offer a counterpoint?
Sure.
Okay, what if they seek out these fruits, nuts, pufferfish, whatever the case is, to alter their conscious state because they need an escape from thinking about eating, not dying, and reproducing?
I love it. I think we've got to only speculate. I don't know what escape would mean for an animal in terms of how we think of drugs and escaping for us as humans. Again, gets sort of interesting when you think about this maybe unsettling parallels between religion and psychoactive substances, that are altering your
I think it's a great
consciousness.
parallel. It doesn't make me uncomfortable at all. I'm like, let's do it. In fact, so the name of your new book, I have it here, Sacred Drugs, How Psychoactive Substances Mix with Religious Life. That sounds awesome. And you may have to come back because that is so up my listeners' alley.
Okay. Well, maybe that will be for another time. But in any case, that there is that sense of, to get to the heart of it is like, what is religion?
Right.
How do you define what it means to be religious? Can religion be a form of escape? Jesus will come and save me from, the suffering in this world. Is that an escape in the same way as, oh man, I need to smoke this joint because, the day has been so rough and the world's falling apart or whatever. And I need some more immediate, not gratification. immediate salvation of some
Yeah.
kind. But anyway, so that there are ways in which we can understand what I'm trying to say as the prevalence of our religious life, in so many different aspects of culture and society that we
Yeah.
might not normally think of when we want to explore religion.
Well, and our propensity towards ritual too, which is like really like a close cousin to religion, because then you ask the question, well, what is ritual and what is just, the thing that we do every day?
Yes.
For example, like we talked about, the labor and delivery doctors not washing their hands. Okay, so now you do this water ritual and suddenly people don't die. So you can see where you could
Yes.
assign spiritual qualities to that, but is it a ritual? And so it's so interesting to swing this all back around to death, how like the Appalachian people, all of their traditions and even like just superstitions that we all have, it just becomes woven in how we behave, yet we assign identities and status as though they're separate from all of these thoughts and feelings and complications.
Oh, yes. I mean, I think that's what I like to try to teach the students is, breaking away from this sense of compartmentalization or somehow identity is fixed and stable and is always the
Yeah.
same, but get into the messiness of how all of this in terms of real life spills, across different boundaries. And it's difficult, again, to sort of reduce it and explain it all away by saying, oh, it's just neurochemicals or,
Right.
or it's just social pressures or something. There's a lot at work, and especially around these taboo topics, death, sexuality, drugs, especially things around what we do with our bodies that again, I think are particularly charged with sacred, spiritual, religious meanings and contestations, for sure. Because certainly to study religion is to study conflict.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Okay, so let's go back to embalming. I think that's
Okay.
where
Sorry, yeah.
oh no, don't
Yeah.
apologize. I enjoyed that
Okay.
rabbit trail so
Okay.
much.
Okay, good.
Okay, so we were talking about the Civil War and we're talking about how embalming wasn't really a thing. In your book, I learned that embalming was more of a thing for medical schools so that people could like study a body. But then President Lincoln died. Can you talk about that?
That is a turning point. That's a pivotal moment in the history of death in America, as far as I'm concerned, and others too have written about it. During the Civil War, embalming became a thing where entrepreneurs would offer their services to northern families to find a way to ship the bodies of their deceased relatives back from what were mostly southern battlefields north. No cars, airplanes, and so on, only trains, and often in summertime. Lots of challenges. Anyway, it's during the Civil War that someone comes up with embalming, and in particular, arterial embalming. So it's very different than the sort of embalming we think of in terms of ancient Egypt. So cut to Lincoln in the end of the Civil War, he's shot, assassinated, and immediately, embalmed. To be able to go on what became I think it's a 20-city tour, being carried on a train where the body was transported from D.C. to Illinois and made various stops along the way. And in most cases, the body would be put on display where thousands, tens of thousands, I think sometimes hundreds of thousands of people would come and try to get a last look at Lincoln's body. So this helped to bring embalming to the public eye because embalming was reported on in the media. There was media coverage of the sort of technical aspects of what embalmers do and the various challenges of keeping Lincoln's face, in particular, presentable. So this, in a very top-down way, helps to legitimate embalming as a acceptable form of preserving the dead and being integrated into the American funeral.
And it seems to me that there's, again, status cannot be separated from this story. He's the president, so he has status, and then he was embalmed, and then he took a tour. People needed to believe he was dead. Like, I mean, I understood it cognitively when I read it in your book, but like my visceral response was like, that's odd.
At first glance, embalming is odd, I think,
Yeah,
just
that's
generally. But in terms of this question of status, I agree. This is something that we see, across the board in many different social settings. Status will determine your ultimate fate in terms of your physical presence. Well, if not, your spiritual afterlife. But there's all kinds of interesting kind of meta-status activity that's going on, too, that has to do with symbolism and especially the symbolism of leaders, important political figures. So with Lincoln, he represented the ideals of the United States. And so preserving, his body was a kind of symbolic effort to preserve the political body. There was some kind of correspondence between the state of his decaying body and, what the social body is supposed to represent and how it is held together. So I think, there is a complexity, too, to the ways in which major political figures are disposed of, after their death.
Yeah, because JFK, that also was an interesting example.
Yes, and kind of uncanny in the parallels with Lincoln, although with Kennedy, you didn't have an open casket. And with Kennedy, we are in the ongoing kind of transformation that's tied to media. So his body didn't go on any funeral journey in an extended sense, but it was televised. His funeral was televised. It was just on all media, and it was constant coverage. And that, too, I think, was a representation of searching for a social glue, because that's often what death forces us to do, is like not just mourn the individual who is gone, but also reaffirm social cohesion. Like death can't, just sort of destroy the integrity of the social body or the social community. So I think that, we see that media, even more so now, plays an important role in being that platform for how we cope with death and how we kind of make sense of death and even what we think of the disposal of the dead.
Well, that's how we display status also. So like with Kennedy, what I found so interesting in your book was that, Jackie had
His wife,
Jackie
yeah.
Onassis.
Yes.
Yeah. She was responding to a book that created a big stink in the funeral industry that was very scathing
Right.
of, funeral directors and how much money they make and how they pressure you and how it can be predatory. And so she was like trying to balance this weird social status of being the late president's wife and pleasing all the people that were of that status, but also, respecting the image of like him being a man who represented the people.
Yes.
And the people are raising eyebrows at the funeral industry.
Yes, yes, yes. It's interesting to think of the conflicts that can emerge in this situation, but also with Abraham Lincoln and the role of Mary Todd Lincoln there. There's interesting similarities in who controls the body of the dead president. Is it the wife, the spouse, the widow, or is it the national family? There's that conflict over how a president fits in to the social environment. And again, in these tragic moments, I think we see that played out. In Mary Todd Lincoln's case, really horrific, really kind of a terrible, sad story ultimately, in terms of her fate. It's a different world in the 60s. And I think, the book that you're talking about was written by Jessica Mitford. It's called The American Way of Death. And it it was a pivot point. Like Lincoln's death, I think that book, published in 1963, right before Kennedy's death and funeral, just again, to overuse this phrase, changed the death landscape in America. What you're saying in terms of how Jackie responded and thinking about, how is the public going to interpret this? And what do I need as someone who's been married to the president? You kind of see and can read about how that plays out for her, and how it speaks to some of these dynamics around status when it comes to, again, a major political figure. Maybe you have similar things when, the other main class of people who are given incredible sort of status and standing in our society are, of course, celebrities. And so, thinking about celebrity deaths is a whole other avenue that I like to go down. But certainly thinking about the presidents raises all kinds of interesting topics.
Well, I think we're entering into the territory of death psychology, because with death psychology, it's like all the humanness gets even more complicated, because with people who are like presidents, or as you pointed out, celebrities, we feel ownership of their business. Like Chuck Norris just passed away, and everyone's like, well, what happened? How did he pass away? And I don't know if that information has been made public. I tend to be on the side of like, that is none of my business. I will remember Chuck Norris as Texas Walker Ranger. Thank you very much. But it's like everyone wants to know all the details. And I see all these clickbait articles on social media that are like, oh, what really happened? And so it's strange, because death psychology has this super personal, intimate family member side that came from, what we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation, middle America, taking our deceased loved one out to the family graveyard. And now we're arguing about how people we don't even know in real life died.
Mm-hmm. And yet it's so powerful. It's such a important, what I would call important religious force in American society, for sure. Thinking about celebrity and what you could call celebrity religion, another place where we invest our devotions and faith and rituals and so on.
Do you see any trends in modern America towards that intimate relationship with death again, despite all of the history behind our outsourcing it?
Absolutely. I think it's the same thing with in birth, right? And some of those movements, there is an effort to resist the commodification, the institutionalization, the kind of traditions that no longer hit. And for many people, I think this is surely a trend to rediscover a certain sort of intimacy when someone dies. It may not be the case that you are handling the body and burying it on your own, but there are now, as you know, sort of communities and memorial societies and all kinds of organic groups that help people make choices. This is all about sort of freedom of choice. And this is going out on a limb and being a bit, kind of overgeneralizing. But for most of the 20th century, most people didn't have choices, really. I mean, it was a very standard American way of death. You embalm, you display in the funeral home, you have the ceremony there, and then you take the dead to a cemetery that's separate. So we've seen post Jessica Mitford, the slow but gradual expansion of choices in how we handle the dead.
It's interesting because I kind of wonder if there's it's a double-edged sword, because we have all these choices. If it just can, I don't know, cause us some harm, even though it is kind of nice to have choices. Like, I was trying to find out what are the laws in the state of Florida when it comes to, funeral and burial. And I guess they're pretty flexible. But when you list out the choices, there's so many. Do you want to be cremated? There's something now called a water cremation. I still don't understand that. There's regular burial, there's embalming, there's organic burial. Would you like to be a tree? Would you like to be a coral reef or a necklace on your loved one? Like, there's just all these choices. And then that's just for the dead person. The choices for their surviving family members is like, oh, would you like to write the obituary? Oh, that's okay if you don't want to. We slash AI will write the obituary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so
Mm-hmm.
now there's like grief bots. And, would you like us to take your dead loved one's social media content and create a grief bot that you can
Yeah.
interact with? Like, it's kind of too much.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that, and I get that. That is a symptom of our consumer society, and now the number of choices. What does that mean? Does it
Well, if you
mean,
have a
oh,
lot of choices and you don't make time to think about them, all you have is overwhelm. So, because like if you're every silent moment you are input, 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 scroll, scroll, scroll. I'm never just in my thoughts. I'm never taking a moment to think my thoughts.
yeah,
Then it doesn't matter that you have options because the options choose you. You don't become intentional with what's laid out in front of you.
yeah. It's tough to make sense of this when you're looking at it from like the point of view I'm looking at it from, which is religious studies. For me, immediate thought is, well, religion isn't as powerful as it once was. What's the most important responsibility for any religion, right? How do you handle death? I mean, at least that's what I think. And now there's traditions and a strong Christian Protestant imprint around death has, disappeared in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are economic factors. Well, I don't want to spend an exorbitant amount. I'm going to have low cost burial and just do the bare minimum. Or, yeah, I want this more elaborate fireworks display, or like you're saying, there are all these different choices. So what does that mean about our spirituality? And it's also a time, if I may, again, in terms of demographics, when the sort of largest number of people claiming a religious identity that is referred to as a nun, right? That is None, people who claim no religious identity. That is sort of the biggest piece of the religion pie at the moment, which is interesting because it corresponds with, this proliferation and more public acceptance of alternatives in how we treat the dead. What can be more religiously meaningful? And I say that even for people who are atheists and who decide, well, I don't care what you do with the body or whatever. There's still all kinds of stuff built in there.
Well, you can't escape grief, even if you're atheist.
Yeah, well,
I talked to this one death doula, and she was saying that there's kind of an uptick in people trying to connect with their ancestral death traditions because they are a nun, as you stated. And so they're trying to ground themselves in something that tells them what to do next, because without it, all they have is this menu of options with price tags, and it feels very meaningless.
yes, right. That is probably the case for many people. I think it may also be the case that there's something meaningful in customization, and especially in terms of our consumer culture, where that has sacred possibilities in terms of identity and thinking about temporality or whatever, that you can customize your own funeral details. That too is an interesting phenomenon to get into, which, except for the very high status historically, who would often make their own funeral plans. Most of the masses would never do that. Mm-hmm. And again, in the past few decades, you see an increasing number of Americans who pre-plan something the funeral industry would really resist, early in their history, but who now embrace it and try to find ways to help people, kind of plan out their own funerals in ways that are meaningful to the personality, to the individual. So here too, it's sort of messy, and there are no guardrails. Isn't quite the right word, but it's kind of wild, wild west.
Yeah, it really is. This conversation has been so fun. I am so glad that we did this.
Oh, me too. I appreciate so much the invitation.
Yeah, absolutely. I encourage people to go to your website. Can you give your website a shout out and any other thing that you want people to follow up with?
Oh boy. No, you can just see the website is GaryLaderman.com, and certainly on Instagram and Threads. Feel free, if anyone wants to just write me directly, you can easily find my email. And yeah, I just had a great time talking with you and love this kind of conversation and back and forth. It's what we need more of in this world.
100%. I agree. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you've loved a couple episodes of the show, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Having recent written reviews lets others know that the show is worth tuning into. Just share what you're listening to and why you liked a certain episode. If you're listening on Spotify, you can't leave a written review, but you can leave a rating, and that's equally appreciated. And if you liked this episode, you'll also like the one with the death doula asking if talking about death is morbid or sacred. It's a more practical approach to a similarly framed conversation as this one. That's episode 278. Stay tuned next week for a remastered favorite with a man who, at 16 years old, survived 2 killer whale attacks while lost at sea for 38 days with his family in a 9-foot dinghy. Until then, keep it curious.